Hello and welcome to the My Dietitian Journey podcast. My name is Adam. This is Felicia. She owns the business. She's the dietitian. I'm her husband. But I know how to make a podcast. So I'm here too. Today we're going to talk about structuring a session, your first session.
Yes.
With a new patient. Mm-hmm. We're using the word patient from now on.
We are.
Because patient is the appropriate word for a provider giving care.
Yes.
To that person. That person is your patient. Okay. So we're going to get into structuring your initial session with a new patient.
Yes.
And what that looks like, Felicia's strategy for it. She's done it a million times. So she's kind of an expert, just saying. She has a lot of letters after her name.
Alphabet soup.
Yeah. So let's just jump into it.
Yeah.
What are we going to start with? How do we first approach the first session before you even meet with the patient?
So before you meet with the patient, just kind of my process. So every patient is sent an onboarding email and paperwork for the appointment. And then they also have to include their insurance and their photo ID on file. So I use Simple Practice, and there's a client portal that is embedded, so the patient doesn't have to print anything. Also before the appointment, so I require the paperwork is filled out 24 hours prior, and that's to make sure that we can verify insurance benefits, make sure that the appointment's going to actually be covered, and then also obtain any referrals. So if the patient needs a specific referral from a primary care physician, or if they need a specific diagnosis code for their insurance to cover, we want to make sure that's on file before the appointment, so we know that, again, the service will be covered. And then typically right before the session or a couple of days before, I'm going to look through the paperwork, see if there's any red flags on like the intake form or areas of concern. So this could be really helpful for starting the conversation with the patient during that first appointment. So maybe they have diabetes. That might be something that I want to talk to them about. Or I look for any red flags that might indicate a referral to another healthcare provider. And then also looking at testing needs. So like if they have diabetes, something I would think about for that first appointment is, do they have any labs that they need to get done, or have they gotten done? And maybe I can request a copy of those ahead of time.
Yeah, we've hit some hurdles prior to the initial for patients. I've spent a lot of time on hold with some insurance companies trying to figure things out, just to be told that, whoops, not covered. Mm-hmm. But then the patient got a different story. There's a lot of legwork prior to the first appointment.
Yeah. And there's mixed information and mixed views on this, but I recommend calling to verify benefits, but also encouraging your patient to call and verify benefits. And you can give them a script to call and verify those benefits so they know exactly what to ask for. But it's a good habit for you to get into as well, so you understand what things to ask, and then also that you are documenting that information as well.
Yeah, that's probably a new area for you as a provider, you, the listener, but also your patient is also maybe new to the world of health insurance or not very knowledgeable. Maybe they've had a plan and they don't use it that much, or they don't have to interact with the insurance company very often. So if they call to try to verify benefits, having a script is great, because there's a really good chance they're not going to know what to even ask.
Yeah.
Or like how to formulate what to ask. They don't know what they don't know. So it's probably a brand new world for them if they're asking about their coverage.
Yeah, especially for medical nutrition benefits, and like, do they have coverage, and do they have a copay? Do they not have a copay? Do they have a deductible to be met? Like all of those kinds of things. Sometimes the insurance will just say like, oh, it's a covered benefit, but then do they need to have a certain diagnosis? Like there's other questions that you'd want to ask to make sure that actually is covered.
That's one of the things that you wouldn't expect a patient to know. What diagnosis codes are required for medical nutrition therapy to be a billable service?
Yeah.
For 97802 and 3 to be billable, what diagnosis codes are required, if any? Sometimes there aren't any, sometimes there are. Sometimes you can just bill for BMI. Mm-hmm. Sometimes you need hypertension or diabetes or something, you know. So do you want to talk about how you start your sessions?
Yeah, so my sessions have kind of a structure to them, but they're very flexible. So I usually always start the appointment with, welcome, thanks for filling out the paperwork, ask them if they had any initial questions that they wanted to get started with. I will say 95% of the time when I say that, someone just jumps right into a story about,
here's my problem.
yes,
I like cheese.
here's why I'm here.
And my heart's going to stop.
Exactly. So they just kind of like jump right into it. Some of the questions that I might use would be like, what are you hoping to get from today's session? Or what made you interested in scheduling with me? Or, what is your top priority in terms of the conversation? So those can help. But again, like 95% of the time, people are just kind of jumping right into it. Sometimes people are a little hesitant when they first start the appointment because they're not really sure what to expect and how this is supposed to go. So sometimes I'll start with kind of like a summary. So I'll note the time, give kind of an overview of the appointment. So today is just a time for us to kind of get to know each other, meet up better, understand where you are with your nutrition and your wellness. And we can kind of see what questions you might have, if there's any information that might be helpful, and go from there in terms of like goal setting. So it gives them just kind of like a loose overview, but also knowing that it's, very flexible. One thing I do try to avoid in the very beginning part of a session is to just start like rapid fire Q&A. So like ask a question, they give an answer. Ask a question, give an answer.
Like interviewing them?
Yes. Yeah. It feels like an interview and it feels very impersonal. And so sometimes that can happen with like closed questions. Like when you say, do you exercise? Do you track your intake? And it's like yes, no answers. And that doesn't really... It just sets a tone for the appointment of like the patient's in like the passenger seat and you're just driving the session and they may not feel comfortable like jumping in and sharing things.
Well, do you want the appointment to be more of a conversation than an interview? That's the idea,
yes. Right? Yeah, definitely more of a conversation. And once people get into it too, they start to share more. And I find that even if there's questions that I really need to clarify and ask in terms of information, most of the time, if I get the patient talking, they really share that stuff anyway. So I don't need to be asking all of these, 15 other questions. I can ask like one or two and get the information that I would need to, clarify or help best.
So you're trying to create a conversational environment that encourages the patient to share the information that you would need to ask questions about. And it tends to be the case they just sort of naturally reveal the information you need, given that you're asking the right conversational questions. Do you have any examples of those questions?
Yeah. So one of the things I'll say is like, tell me more about, and then, which it's not a question, but it's like tell me more about your food intake, or tell me more about your history with exercise, or tell me more about your routine. And again, those kinds of questions versus like, do you exercise? I find the patients just kind of like open up and share, well, I start my day with this, and they kind of go off, and it's really easy to then be able to pull information from that. And that's something that, those kinds of questions, like tell me more about, or, when you think about your nutrition, what's an area that you feel like you really want to focus in on? Again, I feel like 90% of the time people have an area that they're like, this is a problem for me, or this is why I'm here. If someone really isn't giving you much to work with, this is where I fall back on that like new patient intake form. I saw in your paperwork that you had noted that you have type 2 diabetes. So tell me a little bit about that. Were you recently diagnosed? Is this a diagnosis that you've had for a while? And again, even though that sounds like a closed question, most of the time patients I find really open up and say, oh, I've had it for a while, but it's not really managed well, or that's really what I'm hoping to get from these appointments is just to better understand my numbers. And again, it gives you lots of information to work with.
Do you ever find yourself in a situation where, because tell me about is a request for information, mm-hmm. and people like talking about themselves.
Yes.
So do you ever find yourself in a situation where you're having to yank the patient back on track, or sort of direct the conversation back toward an area of value to the whole point of the appointment? Because they can go off and start telling you about their cat and their sister's cousin or something.
Yeah, I would say that's probably pretty rare that happens where it's too much in terms of dominating the session. And I will say a lot of people ask like, how long are your sessions? Anywhere from 45 minutes to an hour. So there's lots of time to be flexible.
For an initial usually.
And so there is time where if someone is telling me about their cat, that it's something that we could spend a few minutes, and it also makes them feel more comfortable and more relaxed. So I find that's valuable if they share a little bit of personal details, because then I find that they get more relaxed. And sometimes that could be something we can, you're like, oh, you have a dog? I also have a dog. And it's just like
you're building rapport.
Yes, rapport, exactly. So sometimes I do find people go off a little bit on a tangent. In those cases, again, I really find that sometimes people, they say a lot of things, but it's also important information for me to know. So for example, someone might kind of be going off about their day and their work and how they're stressed about this and that. That tells me that they have a lot mentally going on in terms of juggling workplace, home life, how nutrition fits into all of that. They've got lots of stress on their plate. And I start to think about, okay, they need really realistic strategies, and it gives me insight as to like where they're starting from. So even if it doesn't feel directly related to nutrition, it's still something that can impact their eating habits, their exercise routine. So even if they're seemingly going off topic, I kind of think about how does this relate to how they might be eating or exercising. And most of the time it gives me a lot of insight into their routine and who they are as a person as to maybe tailoring my recommendations based on that.
Yeah, so if you think about it, the appointment is for medical nutrition therapy, and you're treating the patient by taking him through a therapy session. The word therapy is in your service.
It is.
It is therapy. The target factor that you're trying to influence is their nutritional habits, their eating, their lifestyle habits that affect whatever their ailment is. Mm-hmm. But ultimately, it's a therapy session. You're not like, it's not cognitive behavioral therapy.
Yeah.
But approaching it like it's a therapy session and not just directing, do this, don't do that, having that conversation, building that rapport, that's part of therapy. Mm-hmm. Remember that you're a provider of therapy with a nutritional focus.
Yes.
Medical nutrition therapy. That's the whole point.
Yeah.
So if they want to talk about their cat and you can derive some influence on their nutritional habits or their lifestyle habits from that conversation piece, it is valuable. Mm-hmm. I could just, if someone's going on for like a half hour, maybe, rope them back in. I don't know.
Yeah. And sometimes there is points where it's like, my gosh, they've talked for a while. And I usually try to like jot down like keywords they're saying to kind of circle back to. But sometimes I'll be like, I don't mean to cut you off, but I just want to make sure you mentioned a few things in what you shared with me, and I'll highlight the things that are more relevant to the appointment. And so I'll highlight those things and then say, can you tell me more about, and then, a specific point that again relates more to nutrition, and that gives me a little bit more direction to the session itself. I do find when patients are really talkative, that tends to be the first appointment, and that kind of, they're still a talkative person sometimes, throughout the rest of the appointments. But the first appointment, it's like they want to really share with me a lot so I can get kind of caught up to speed. And again, sometimes it's also people unload, I feel like, that first appointment because they've maybe been around a lot of providers and they're just frustrated. They're almost like, if I can just tell you everything that's going on, then we can, get started and you can really help me. And so it's kind of like, sometimes when they're sharing a lot, it's because they just want to put it all out there so I know exactly where they are. And they'll often say like, I knew that was a lot, but I just feel like it was important information for you to know. And so,
Do you ever set the stage such that the patient understands that you'll see them for multiple sessions and that like you don't have to do everything up front? Do you establish that in any capacity?
Yeah. And I kind of, when I start, if I like a little bit more of a session summary, I'll say, we have about an hour for today's appointment, and, today's appointment, me to get to know you, you to get to know me, but also we can kind of get an understanding of what your history looks like and, how we're going to best work together. And then I'll let them know, today's appointment may or may not involve nutrition education or things like that. But at future sessions or today's session, depending on the flow and what makes the most sense, we might be talking about those things. And I let them know that partially because I don't want them to feel like I'm just going to keep throwing all these things at them too. And I think that sometimes relaxes people, like knowing that they don't have to do all these things in the appointment with me, that it's a little bit more of like a relaxed session. Sometimes I do give nutrition education, and sometimes it's really not about me telling them anything in that first appointment, but me getting more information from them, and then also them being able to share with me and catch me up to speed on where they are in terms of the nutrition and their wellness.
So you're tailoring the session to them specifically. Every person's different. Every person's at a different place in their journey of nutrition, as you would say, maybe. I don't know.
Yeah, no,
You
it's
like
absolutely
the word journey, right?
We do like the word journey. But that's exactly, everybody's in a different place. And I will say it's pretty rare, but it has happened. And I've had a few patients this way where they come into the appointment and they're like, okay, I need to know X, Y, Z, or they come with like rapid fire questions. Okay, we'll start there. So sometimes that's how the appointment goes, and they're kind of directing the session, and that's totally fine too. I would just say that most people are not like that when they come into the appointment, at least that I work with anyway.
Well, I would imagine most people don't know what they need to know right away.
Yeah, it tends to be more of my younger clients that are like my younger patients who are like in their 20s or 30s versus like most of my patients are in like the 50 to 60 range. I would say that's like the bulk of my patients. And if someone's in like that 20 to 30 range, a lot of times that's where they come with, I have questions about protein and exercise. So it's someone who might be informed about nutrition already, but they're kind of wanting to make sure that what they're doing is, optimal for them. And that's where I find that they kind of come more prepared in terms of questions to ask me to make use of the time. So
what if a patient isn't very talkative?
So definitely, I do rely on the paperwork a little bit. So like, tell me more about your, you mentioned in your paperwork, you have this condition or that condition. Have you had any education on this, or, have you seen any recent doctors? So that's kind of like clarifying their medical history, but also getting an understanding of what testing they've had, if they need any help with nutrition education in that space. There's a lot of times where I'll just kind of then jump into a 24-hour recall. Now, if anyone remembers like doing a 24-hour recall from like undergrad, if you're a dietitian, it is pretty structured. I don't do it like that. So I just ask them, I want to get a better understanding of your food nutrition habits. So why don't you take me through, a typical day of eating, or if it's easier for you, how about we talk about what you had to eat yesterday or today, depending on the timing of the appointment. And I'll say like starting with breakfast. So I'll have them start. Some people will literally just run through their entire day without me saying anything. And some people I'll kind of, be directing them into the next step. So they'll say, well, for breakfast, I usually have pancakes and a cup of coffee. And then that's usually before I get to work. And then I'll say, okay, and then what's your next meal or snack? So I kind of, prompt them along the way. With doing that, I often find people will share what they're eating. And then they get to the end of the day and they're like, and at night, this is my worst time. Actually, this is probably the worst time. Snacks, I lose control. And so they usually say something along this recall where it's like, here's where my root issue is. Or if let's say they skip a lot of meals, they'll be like, I know I don't eat well. I really want to get into a better routine. And in that case, again, it's like a pinpoint where I could say like, okay, this is a topic we can explore either today or at a future session. So I don't like stop the recall to address that, but I just kind of make a note so then that way we can kind of circle back to it. But that actually helps to get people talking too. And it's, again, me providing a little bit more direction to the appointment, but it also allows them to really explain to me like what their day looks like and an opportunity for them to share what their eating habits look like and how we can kind of address them.
If anyone hears any weird background noise, we have a 5-month-old puppy. He's just kind of romping around a little bit, trying to get him to settle down, but it's not working out so good.
He's doing puppy business.
Yeah. If you're watching on YouTube, I'll throw a picture up. So do you chart during your sessions?
I do now. So if you've listened to any of the previous podcasts, I think the last one was on the contract that I did with Dietitians on Demand, and I learned very quickly how to chart while also running a session. And in doing that, now I chart all the time during my appointments. Before I was like, oh, it takes away from the session. I'm not paying attention, but that's not the case. So my note flow, I have changed to be more representative of how I might go through an actual session. So it makes it easier for me to take notes. At the end of the appointment, I still have to usually go back and make some minor adjustments, but most of the time I'm just, making tweaks and I'm not writing a full-on note afterwards.
So to clarify, you used to not chart during your sessions. You thought it detracted from the session. And then you had a stint with Dietitians on Demand where you worked in bariatric surgery, pre and post care,
Yeah.
right? And you had 15-minute like rapid fire sessions all day for whole 8 hours at a time, and learned that you had to, in order to keep up in that environment, you learned you had to chart while you were going through those appointments, which were more of an interview style, not as talkative and conversational.
Yeah, because you just unfortunately didn't really have too much time. But I learned how to multitask a lot better and not detract from the session while still being able to pull the information. And so that definitely helped. And my being able to like type and not look at the same time. My skills, I guess.
So to any newer dietitians who maybe don't have that experience and maybe haven't had the challenge of having to chart, or even that are new to this, do you recommend that they chart during the session?
Yeah, I would maybe just practice with it. And what I used to do when I started was I didn't necessarily not do anything. I would take like shorthand notes on like a piece of paper. It was just like the typing and looking at the same time. That was what I like couldn't get the flow of, but I would still take like paper notes and then be able to, and then I would put those into the actual note format. I was spending a lot of time. That was the thing. And I wasn't really thinking of it, but now I only have a few minutes. So I would say like, try to practice doing it, even if you don't do an entire note during the appointment, and also see if you need to adjust the way that your appointment is structured in your practice management system, if you use one, because sometimes you need to adjust, the flow of what your template looks like to better align with how you run an actual session.
So do you think it's okay to not chart during an appointment, or is it vital that do you think this is an essential skill to like practice and learn? Like, was it transformative for you when you started doing it during your sessions?
I don't think it's absolutely necessary. I think it is helpful if you are running a busy practice where you have patients blocked, in a day, or you have other things going on. Like when I first started, I didn't have a huge patient load, so it kind of didn't matter. Like I could spend the extra time charting after an appointment or, billing extra, I didn't really need to worry about it too much. And I was, time is money, but I was like, I'm just starting, and it's just, it didn't really matter as much. Now where my time is, not as flexible, and some days I'm seeing patients, back to back, or like having a small gap between, that I need to be more optimized about how I have, the appointment and the time. And I was just spending way too much time, like 15, 20 minutes after for each patient, writing the note and like doing all those things. And it just, sometimes I'd be like, wait, what was this? And I'd have to like look at my notes and it was spending more time. And I feel like it was actually less representative of the session too.
So in terms of accurately recording notes and time management, it's more effective to chart during the session.
Yeah.
And it's a good skill to invest time in and practice.
Yeah,
I think it's
absolutely.
right. Okay. Yeah, and you just happen to have a lot of rapid fire practice. But if you're new to your practice and you're starting getting patients rolling in, it's a good thing to build a skill for over time.
Yeah.
I think. But is that?
Yeah.
Yes.
It's absolutely.
So what are some key things you review with a patient during the first session?
So definitely their medical history. And this is like beyond what is in their paperwork, because in their paperwork, they might say like, I have diabetes, GERD, IBS, that, in some cases they've had IBS for their entire life. They know how to manage it. They know what the triggers are. They don't need to like have any education on that. So I want to identify what of those conditions are they actively seeking assistance on in terms of managing with nutrition. And then also, like if they have diabetes and I'm reviewing their medical history, I want to know, do they test their blood sugar regularly? Making sure I have the accurate medications on file. If they had recent labs done, did they have any past education on diabetes? What their biggest concerns are? If they have GI issues, are they working with a gastroenterologist? Do they know what foods are causing symptoms? So really getting a clear understanding of their medical history. And then also, again, what are their kind of like active chronic conditions and what things are already well managed that they are dealing with. Other big things would be like recent doctor's appointments and, making sure if there was a recent appointment, did they have any specific recommendations from their provider that I need to also be aware of? A lot of times I will find patients get labs done and their physician's like, labs are good. Don't really go over too much else with them. So one thing I find is that I'm often helping a patient to kind of navigate what their results are. Here's your A1C. This is what it was before. Here's what the A1C actually means. Here's your fasting blood glucose level. And so again, reviewing with them if they had recent labs and then actually talking to them about it, that also helps the patient, but also for me to understand kind of where they are in terms of managing whatever condition they have. Obviously, their food and nutrition history, so understanding the foods, the beverages, what they're consuming, their meal timing, their physical activity, what they've done previously, what they're doing now, and then just overall goals. Why are they seeing me? What are they hoping to get out of the appointment? But also long term, what are they looking for in working together?
A physical activity history, rather?
Yes, physical activity history.
And then if they have goals, you review the goals with them too, their goals?
Yeah, sometimes people come in and I'll say a good percentage of people say, I want to lose weight. But it's something that they are always wanting to lose weight, but really they're coming to see me because their blood sugar is elevated, or their blood pressure is elevated, or, they had a recent change in their GI symptoms. And so weight loss is kind of always on their radar, but it's not the priority in terms of us to address. It's focusing on something else that's going on.
Do you often find yourself helping a patient interpret their labs? Is that something you've done frequently or often?
More frequently lately than before, which I think is just interesting. And I think part of it has been with COVID and maybe some of the virtual appointments that are going on, that they're a lot quicker. And sometimes it doesn't mean that they're not provided a good session or care from their provider. It's just the big thing is your labs look good, or watch your blood sugar, or I'm happy you don't need to change your medications. And that's kind of it. And then they're like, well, what does good mean? What do these numbers mean? What is total cholesterol versus LDL? Which one am I supposed to be looking? That kind of thing, where I'm telling them here's what LDL is. Here's HDL is the one you want to be. And so kind of walking them through that. And that's a big thing that, again, I just find sometimes the provider just doesn't have the time to sit and talk to them. And if their labs are good, they'll often just say that, or, oh, your A1C went up. Make sure you're watching what you're eating, and then kind of leave it at that.
Do you find that patients derive value from having those labs interpreted for them, or going into greater detail on what the numbers mean? Do patients typically enjoy that, or do they engage with you on that?
Yeah, most of the time when I start that conversation, and if they have labs, they share it with me, or they've sent them to me ahead of time. I'll say, I have your recent labs, and I just want to know if you had any questions about anything that was on there. And a patient recently was like, well, I'm not really sure what I'm looking at. Can you walk me through what you're seeing? And so I'll look at them and I'll say, okay, so your A1C was 5.7 and it went down to 5.4, and I did A1C is an average blood sugar over 3 months. Okay, great. We move on to the next. So I'll kind of highlight key things. For one patient, it was their labs in terms of their cholesterol, their lipid panel was good. And their doctor said it was good. And they were like, but my LDL is still high. Is that a good number, a bad number? And so we talked about how their total cholesterol had come down, their HDL went up. So overall risk had greatly been reduced, which is why the physician was happy. But here's where the targets were, and here's how close they were to the target. So I usually ask before I just start spitting all this information at them in terms of if it would be helpful. But most of the time it's the patient is asking me to go over something with them, or when I ask them if you have any questions about your labs, that's the first thing they're like, well, I don't know what I'm looking at, or is the LDL the good cholesterol or the bad one? I heard, what affects that? And that also brings up a lot of really good nutrition education points too, where someone will say, well, my HDL went down, how do I increase that? And that's an opportunity for me to provide some education in that space.
Do you set goals for every session with the patient?
It depends on the patient. And I will say that my goals now are much different than what they used to be. When I first started, I used to have everybody set a formal SMART goal, exercise 3 times a week for 20 minutes. And I've kind of moved away from that because my style and how I run a session is a lot different now and more focused in on motivational interviewing. and really identifying where the patient is in terms of their stage of change. And most people are not ready to set goals. And
stage of change, referring to the theoretical, or what's the
trans-theoretical model, yes, which we did, I think, a series on 3 podcasts.
Yeah, I'll link the playlist for that.
Yeah, and I'd say most people are in this like contemplation where they're like weighing the pros and cons of change, or preparation stage where they're like thinking about and ready for change and making an action step in the next 30 days. But they're not ready to like actually take action, like go to the gym yet. And so if we set goals like that, most of the time they're not going to be accomplished between the appointments. So I kind of take a step back and use that first to second appointment as a time to gather more information about their routine, their lifestyle, their food habits, their exercise habits, having them track GI symptoms. So there's some kind of action item, but it's not like you need to go and do this, like go out to the gym or start eating more vegetables. It's like, let's just get a really clear picture of where you are right now and not to have them start making changes to their life just yet. And that usually I think is a lot more receptive for the patients than to just jump into all of these really clear action items that they need to start addressing.
How do you typically close a session?
So usually I give a little bit of a summary about what happens. So we talked, and an example could be, so we talked a little bit about your nutrition, your exercise. We talked a little bit about managing IBS. Are there any additional questions you have before we close out for today's session? Most of the time people will say no. Sometimes people will say like, actually, I do have a really quick question. Usually I try to do this at like the 10 or 5 minute mark before the hour, only because I find sometimes if people do have a question, then it gives them that space to be able to talk. And then I ask them if they were interested in scheduling a follow-up session or if they wanted to touch base with me. Why I do that is sometimes people, maybe we're not a good fit. Sometimes people need to kind of think about it. And so I usually give them an out, or, you can reach out to me and let me know, and it takes the pressure off. And I find that helps with cancellations. That if someone really isn't interested in scheduling that second appointment, they don't feel obligated at the end of the appointment. So usually a summary and then like next steps in terms of scheduling.
So just some random questions that you've gotten for this sort of thing. We're going to rapid fire through a few of these. So if a patient's uncomfortable talking about their weight, but you need that number for a chart or insurance, how do you navigate that?
So every intake form for patients has a section where they fill in their height and their weight. Part of this is to calculate things like BMI, if that's something that I need to bill for. One thing I bring up with patients, and this is something that depending on how the appointment goes, I either bring it up in the beginning or towards the middle, is I let them know that, in certain cases, I need to have an accurate weight on file. I understand that weight is not a comfortable topic for a lot of people. And I also am not weight-centered myself as a practitioner. I let them know that if they are looking to track their weight, that's absolutely something that we can do. But if they're also not looking to track their weight and they're going to look at other metrics for success, that, they can either send me the weight through email or we can share that in the beginning part of the appointment and just kind of move on and not be like a conversation topic. I find that pretty much all of my patients are okay with that they understand why it's necessary to be in there. But the fact that I'm not pushing them to have this big conversation about weight, and the fact that in order for them to make any changes to their weight, there needs to be something else done. Like they need to exercise or eat a different way, or sometimes it's stress management or relating to a medication or something like that. And so I'm taking the pressure off of that conversation for them. And most of them are just okay with being able to have to talk about weight or, send it over to me in some fashion. So
have you ever had a patient refuse to give you their weight?
No.
Or put up a fight?
No, never had someone.
So framing it that way has always been successful for you.
Yes.
You have a 100% success rate with that.
Yes.
Well, that's good. Not many things have a 100% success rate.
I know, yeah.
What are some things to avoid in the first session?
Definitely lecturing. So like starting the appointment and just like telling people what to do or, overburdening with information. I did this when I first started. I used to do face-to-face appointments. Now I do virtual, all virtual at this point. I would come into an appointment with a folder and like handouts and like all of this stuff. And so when my appointments were much different back then too, but I would just start like giving information. And then I probably gave everybody like 5 or 10 handouts. Like it was really ridiculous.
I remember these handouts. I remember your folders. She was really into it.
And like my sticker for like Bras Nutrition and my business card was in there. I was like very proud of these, but some people really liked them because they're like, oh, this is lots of really great information. If I had coupons, I stuck them in there. But sometimes it was just like straight up overwhelming for people. And I also found that they just became like a hub and dumping ground for all of the stuff that I would give them every appointment. Cause then I would come with more I had a binder that I would travel with handouts in it. And I'm like, oh, we talked about whole grains. I have a handout,
Handout fatigue.
Yes. So don't do that. One, it's just also, I find that people weren't really utilizing it much either. And so it ended up being like a little bit of a waste in terms of like paper, but just really overwhelming for the patient. Directing too much in the session. So like this kind of goes along with like lecturing and also just telling the patient too much of what to do. It just, again, I find that I don't get a lot from the patient in those cases, and I don't get to know them enough. And then I also don't build that rapport and that connection with them. And I found that people weren't scheduling as often. That actually happened a lot when I first started, where I'm like, why aren't people scheduling follow-ups? It's like, because I was just kind of talking at them.
Beating them over the head with stuff.
Exactly.
Here's a folder. Take this handout on broccoli.
Oh, yes.
Have a sticker. Bam. Sticker.
And so some of it was like, I felt like, oh, if I gave them all this information, they're going to get a lot out of it. People get a lot out of being able to have a connection with me and having someone listen and understand than they do with 15 handouts. So
yeah, the long game is more effective than information dumping.
Yeah.
Who'd have thunk it? Well, you were new. You don't know. You develop the skill over time figuring this out. It's therapy, It's not education. It's therapy.
Yeah.
It can be education too, but primarily therapy.
Yes.
Medical nutrition therapy.
Medical nutrition therapy.
Do you do meal plans for patients?
Not anymore. So that in my time of just sharing things, when I first started, I thought like, okay, everybody keeps asking for meal plans. I need to create meal plans. If anyone's actually created a meal plan from scratch, it takes forever. And I would tailor them to the patient. So like, it wasn't just me creating like the standardized plan I gave to 15 patients. It was like, I created a meal plan specific to that patient, to the calories, the carbs, all of that, without software either. So like hand doing everything. What I started to find, one, beyond being time consuming, they were getting these meal plans. And like I had one patient who was adamant, I need a meal plan. I know this will help me. And then I like went and saw her like 2 weeks later and asked her how the meal plan went. And she's like, oh, it was on the table with my folder. She's, oh, I meant to get around to it, but then I don't know. I used the one day and then I just felt like it wasn't the day that I usually would eat. And it was just like this whole big thing of like, why shouldn't you use the meal plan? And I was just like, I spent like all of these hours on this meal plan. But I found that people want meal plans, but they really want ideas, and they also want something that's going to be realistic for them. So now my approach has changed. When we talk about meal plans in a session, one of the key things that I do is that I get an understanding of where they are in terms of their nutrition. And then we talk about like specific tweaks to make. And then I also have like a meal plan template where it's more of like options and then ideas for how to build a meal. So it's less about like key, like this structured plan and more about flexibility and tailoring it towards them. And it also takes the pressure off of me to be able to create this like full on structure.
All right. What do we think about wrapping this one up? Any final thoughts?
Your first appointment will probably not go in the exact way that you would like it to. So take the pressure off yourself. Spend time just listening to your patient and asking questions that give your patient space to talk. Understand that you don't need to fit in everything to that appointment, and you have more appointments to work with to be able to fill any gaps that are in that session. The other thing to think about too is that you are human, and so you may not always say things that maybe will be the best thing to say, and you'll find your footing along the way as to how to really navigate a session. It's not always that intuitive, but it's also something that we don't get a lot of time in undergrad and the internship to really, really practice these skills. And so I think that just the more you do it, the better you'll get at it, as cheesy as that is. But then also just know that, you will find your flow in terms of the session and how that's going to work best for you and also the patients that you want to work with too.
Yeah. Don't beat yourself up if it goes poorly the first 10 times, whatever. There's a few bumps along the way. You'll learn, reflect and move on.
Yeah.
Right? Felicia's first 50 sessions probably didn't go as well as her following 50.
Yeah.
And then now, hundreds of sessions later, I don't know, you in the thousands yet? Maybe.
Yeah.
Probably. They are that much more tailored to the experience that she's going for. And then, you as a provider find your own rhythm and your own style too. You have to develop that and figure out what that's going to be.
Yeah.
You need sessions to do that too, right?
That's absolutely, like, you find the style that's going to work for you and also the patients that you want to attract. And a lot of the patients that I work with now have, besides having like diabetes, heart disease, they also have depression and anxiety and things like that. And so a lot of times going into the session, there's a lot more of like nervousness or not sure what to say, or like there's just a lot more there. And so being able to kind of create this like warm, inviting environment that's not super clinical, I feel like helps patients relate to feel more relaxed and then share more with you. And you get this better partnership that is more conducive to helping them with reaching their goals.
All right. I think that's going to do it for us here at the My Dietitian Journey podcast. Join us next time when we talk about something different relating to private practice. We're not there yet. We should probably schedule these out at some point, a few in advance, so we can say what's coming next. But check the description for links to some relevant stuff that we talked about during this podcast. And we wish you well. Thanks so much for being with us.